Hi, everyone. This is Vanessa, also known as the International Immigrant, and welcome to my podcast. This is a place where we discuss everything immigration related, from the desire to work in another country for a few years, to test the waters, to studying abroad in the hopes of opening up some opportunities, and of course, full immigration with a cargo container of furniture and a residence visa stamped in your passport. If this is your first time and you want to know who I am and why I started this podcast, please watch or listen to the first episode, as there are both audio and video versions available. So today we are going to change things up a little and talk about the effects of immigration on the children of immigrants. So my guest today is a dear friend of mine that I met whilst we were doing our Honours Thesis together at the University of Western Australia. Although we were 20 years apart in age, we developed a very gentle and supportive friendship. She is the daughter of Malaysian immigrants of Chinese descent and is a first-generation Australian. And one of her greatest challenges has been negotiating how to grow into her own person whilst being pulled between the Western culture that she has grown up in and the more traditional beliefs of her parents coming from an Asian culture. So it's my pleasure to welcome Lillian. Hey, honey, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I must apologize if my cat is meowing in the background.
Okay.
But
This
yeah,
is a
I'm always
cat-friendly space, so I am always welcoming cats and cat people into it.
love that.
So please just introduce yourself quickly and let us know where you live, what you're doing for work, and your current situation.
All right, so my name's Lillian. I'm a psychologist and I work in Perth, Australia. I was born here as well. So pretty much have spent the last 27 years in little old Perth. When you say life situation, what do you mean by that?
Are you married or single, living alone?
Yep, so I live with a housemate called Lillian. And I haven't actually told Vanessa this, but I have a partner. His name is Jake. He is very lovely and studies Japanese.
Very good. Japanese, born in Australia or born in Japan?
No, born in Sydney actually, but learning Japanese.
Very good. So, because we are going to talk about your life as a child of immigrants, can you tell me a little bit about your childhood and what that was like for you?
I think probably like a lot of people, I would describe my childhood as being quite strange. So my parents, as Vanessa mentioned, are both from Malaysia, and they came over when they were in their late 20s, early 30s. I have one older sister who's 10 years older than me and a younger brother who's 6 years younger than me. And I think growing up, it was very clear that there was a big contrast between, sorry, it's my cat, between my parents' culture and the culture that I was being encouraged to assimilate into. And keep in mind, I also grew up during the Howard years. So John Howard, for those who don't know, was Australian Prime Minister in the early 2000s. And he was quite anti-immigration. And during his period of government, people like Pauline Hanson came out who were very openly against Asian immigration. So growing up in that kind of context, being visibly a person of color was quite difficult sometimes.
And when did you start to feel torn between the two cultures that you were sort of trying to, or that you were exposed to? Let's put it that way.
I think probably earliest exposure would have, well, earliest feeling torn between two cultures would have been when I entered primary school. So it's quite obviously like a very like white primary school that I went to. And so it was quite confusing, especially with parents who like maybe weren't as emotionally literate as other parents, to have to negotiate going to my all white primary school and speaking only English to coming home and having to be in quite like a traditional Asian household, being expected to study all the time instead of play and do chores. Like I always wondered like why my dad and mum were the way they were, whereas like always seemed to be like on TV and at school, like happy white families just spending time together.
What language did you speak in the house when you were a child?
Well, so being Malaysian, my parents like speak a lot of languages. So I think my dad will speak about five. So he speaks like Hokkien, Cantonese, Mandarin, Hainanese, Bahasa Malaysia, and English. And so like I heard like various bits of all of these languages growing up at home, which is probably like in retrospect a very cool thing about growing up Malaysian Chinese. My parents always spoke Hokkien to each other, and they never actually realized that I knew what they were saying until like very recently. Yeah, no. That's just how language works. Kids pick it up, whether you teach it to them or not. But to us, they would speak a mixture of Chinese and English. And initially, like when I was growing up, like we would just all speak Chinese, like Mandarin to each other. But as I got into primary school, I started to become really ashamed of my Chinese heritage and speaking Chinese and being associated with anything Chinese. So my Chinese abilities kind of like fell by the wayside. And like to this day, like I speak very little Chinese to my parents. It's mostly English.
But you understand it, even though you don't speak it that
Oh, I
much.
definitely understand it, and like I can speak if forced to. Hello, Seiko. But yeah, it's primarily English.
And it's very interesting that you say that, because when I was teaching English in Costa Rica, that is something that I would sort of find people that were learning English with me because a child had gone, or a sibling had gone to the US or somewhere, and they kept saying to me that the children of about the same age that you mentioned just suddenly become very, very ashamed of the heritage and don't want to speak to the parents in their native language. They want to speak in English. They want to respond in English. And this just seems to be a fairly normal developmental trajectory for children of immigrants, or children who are speaking one language at home and speaking another language in their school environment and their friends' environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like if like being a child and adolescent psychologist now, I think if my parents had the ability to sit down with me and explain like what racism was,
Right.
that sometimes people are hateful and say stupid things, and that like yes, like it can be difficult being different, but there's also some things to be proud of. Like my ability to speak Chinese would look very different today, but unfortunately they have their own trauma histories and weren't able to do that for me.
Right, right. And yeah, and you hear that quite often. How did you navigate within yourself having to bridge this gap? Like you said, you kind of became a bit of ashamed of it. And as you grew up through adolescence, because adolescence is usually the time of life where, you will know this in your work, is the most difficult for a child to try and fit in and find themselves. How did you navigate that? Like, did you just refuse to speak it? Did you just hate coming home to the traditions that you had? Did you want to spend more time in the Western culture, or did you really just find that you didn't feel that you fit into either?
I don't think I've ever felt like I fit into either. I think, like, if I look at the trajectory, it was like completely hating Asian culture to like in high school. I became friends with a lot of traditionally Asian kids who like were really like in touch with their cultures.
Mm.
And so like I kind of swung the other way. Like I became really ashamed of the fact that I didn't speak good Chinese. Uh, but I feel like now, or at least in like the past 5 years, there's been like a lot more like active talking about like racism and
Mm-hmm.
colonialism and the after effects of that. And so, and like a lot more people of color like are now featured in the media,
Right.
which is really great. And so like I feel like there's been a little bit more acceptance of like the fact that like no, I'll never fall into like either category of like being Chinese or like Australian, like in the traditional sense, but like there's a lot of people who are just in the liminal spaces like I am.
What do you consider yourself? If somebody says to you, what's your nationality? What do you answer?
I think like having grown up here, like it's just Australian. And I guess like I'm used to that question, like, where are you
Mm,
really from now?
right. I know. And it's
Probably,
such
yeah.
an annoying, it's such an awful question,
It
actually.
really is.
I
I
know.
think that recently at a school case conference, I was like, mate, like, have you heard me talk? Like, I'm probably more Australian than you. Um, yeah, but like I don't know, like I feel like as I've gotten older, there's just been like more and more people like talking about like how alienating and horrible it is sometimes to like be in these like between spaces. So
Mm,
I don't feel so alone anymore, and that's really nice.
that's awesome. No, I understand. I haven't been in your situation, so I can't understand your exact situation, but I do definitely understand being alienated. And it's strange because I kind of feel a little bit alienated in my country of birth at the moment, which is bizarre. And I think, spoke about it in my last, in the one before the last podcast about immigrants in a pandemic, that I've changed so much in the last 3 years and really come to understand how I identify and where I feel the belonging. And it's just so not here. And it's bizarre that you can grow up in a country and then just feel that people are aliens to you when you return to them. But anyway, so you said that you have two siblings. You have an older sister and a younger brother. Did you have much support from your siblings during this? Did they go through the same journey as you?
I think so, but because of the age gaps between us, like I think when I was going through like the most painful periods, like I didn't really have anyone to talk to. Like
Right.
I don't know, when I entered primary school, like my brother was an infant and
Mm,
my sister was living in Japan. So it was quite like it was very hard to make sense of it on my own. And like as a I don't know, as a primary school kid, like unless you've got like people who are able to like model how to talk about emotions like
mm.
loneliness and alienation, like it's really hard to make sense of. So like I think for a very long time, like I felt quite alone, but not so much anymore.
And it's
And
interesting
sometimes
because children are not, we know this, children are not born racist. They're just not. We know this. It's something that's imposed on them by culture, by parental views, by environment. The kids that you went to primary school with, had they already had that sort of exposure where they looked at you differently, or were they just kids being kids and really kind of didn't see the difference?
it's hard to tell. Like I have pretty hazy memories, but like I
Yeah.
think for sure it's like a bit of both. Um, Like I remember just like people like hello, calling me like ching chong and like I don't know, like pulling things up with their
Oh my
pulling
God.
their eyes out, like making fun of my eyes, even though actually technically they're double lidded. Um, yeah, it is kind of strange seeing kids like just do that
I know.
willingly.
And you
And
know
I think,
they're emulating it from another environment. It's just that these are just not things that they come up with automatically within themselves.
yeah, like absolutely. But I guess like as a kid, like being in that context, like telling me that like wouldn't have helped me. Like all I felt was like rejection and being
Mm.
alone. Mm, yeah.
So how do you feel about it all now? Like looking back on that and the pain and the difficulty. And I also met you at a time in your life where you were struggling quite a lot, and the added pressure of this, honors at university, which kind of takes it up a notch. And the person that you are now is just like almost two completely different people. So I mean, I've seen in the time that we've known each other. I mean, when did we do the honors thesis? I think it would have been 2016 that we met. So it's been for 5 years. How do you feel about it now, looking back on it?
That's a big question. Um, hmm. I think I definitely still oscillate between like feeling confident. Like today, like I feel good and confident because like I'm like in a pretty good place with work, and like had some healthy corrective experiences like where people have like really recognized me and accepted me for like who I am and like the work that I do. But for a long time, like I didn't have that. So I like do tend to oscillate between like feeling confident and comfortable in the fact that like I inhabit like two different worlds, to like sometimes like going like flashing back to those moments where I felt like alone and scared. And like to be honest, with this like coronavirus stuff happening at the moment, like there's a lot of racism flying around,
Oh my
especially towards
God, I know. Yeah.
and so like I've been like accused in a lift of like not keeping coronavirus in China despite never actually having set foot in mainland China in my entire life. So like it's like moments like that remind me like how much I still have to process, because like I had to put it away for so long. And I think Australian culture and like rebuttals to like complaints of racism are just like suck it up, like you should just be
Mm.
tougher, like people are mean and shit. But yeah, it's so I do like have a lot of that like internal like gaslighting as well. I'm just like, suck it up. Like this is just what immigrants have to deal with, and children of immigrants have to deal with. And yeah, you can't really do anything about it. So like I do flip between like the confidence and the powerlessness like quite a
Mm.
bit, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I feel for you. Obviously, I am not from Asian descent, and so I haven't had any anti-Asian sentiment leveled at me during this time. But I've been very aware of it going on, and a lot of stuff going on in the US and stuff like that. Even my dear sweet Canada, that generally is um, better. But yeah, that just sucks, and that shit needs to stop. I mean, I'm just so over that. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, you know, countries all over the world have done things that they shouldn't have done, or governments have made choices that they shouldn't have made, and it's got nothing to do with the people of those countries, regardless of whether there's fault or no fault. I'm just so over that stuff. But yeah, I'm really sorry that if I was back in Perth right now, I'd be asking you for names and numbers. Okay, so um, so my next question is, what advice would you give to other kids in a similar situation now? And I mean, now that you as you say, you're a clinical psychologist now. Those people that are listening and watching won't have known, but before this podcast, Lillian and I were talking, and she's just submitted her PhD for review. And so that's a huge thing that she's been working on. So now with all of your training, like your psychological training, as well as what you went through, what advice would you give to kids in that kind of situation?
I'm still amazed, to be honest, that I'm paid to give therapy to kids. But actually, like some of the best, like most healing kind of, I don't know whether I call it advice, but I recently was listening to this podcast about Selena, the Mexican American singer who died tragically. I think the podcast is called Anything for Selena. And it was quite interesting because like she also grew up in a similar situation, like despite like being like countries away, like she also grew up in a similar situation. So she is like of Mexican descent, born in Texas, I think it was. And it sounds like she went through like quite a similar journey to like me and probably a lot of immigrants, where like there was a lot of hatred directed towards Mexican Americans at the time that she was growing up.
It still
and,
is.
Like, yeah, definitely. And I think like up until like the age of like, I don't know, like until she was like an adult, basically, like she only spoke English and she only started learning like Spanish when she started to become famous. And I think that was like quite inspirational to me because like she is like so adored by like so many people around the world. She didn't have to be like speak completely perfect Spanish, and she didn't have to be like completely American. Like she was her own person. And I remember one of the podcasters who was going through her own experiences with her own son who was starting to refuse to speak like Spanish at home, saying that like it's okay, like we understand that it's hard to inhabit both worlds, and like Spanish and Mexican culture will always be there ready for you to pick up when you want it to be there. And so like I think that overarching that kind of message is like a sense of like kindness and compassion to how difficult it can be to be in that between space. And I guess my advice would be around that, just trying to be like as compassionate as possible towards yourself, like despite like pressures from like two opposing cultures to be more like this and be less like that, or be more like this. Just know that it's okay to take your time to figure out who you are, and there's a bunch of people waiting for you on the other side when you do find out.
Look, absolutely. And I think, I don't know about you, but definitely what I've noticed, and as you know, I've lived in a lot of different countries and over the span of the last sort of 20 years. And what I have sort of noticed is a lot more diversity coming into television and into, like, you know, I will be 48 in a couple of weeks. And when I was a child, hell, South Africa only got television in 1976. I was 3 years old. And so, you know, we just had these, and it was a very, very white privileged environment, despite the fact that white people were in the minority. And I just grew up with seeing people around like me. I mean, you know, I'm gay, so that definitely, as I went through adolescence, I didn't see a lot of that representation, which came much later on in my life. But everybody was white. Everybody sort of spoke the kind of the same language. I saw myself represented everywhere. And now you're just seeing a lot more diversity in kids' shows and in shows in general. And hopefully that's helping so many more young kids who just don't feel that they fit into the majority that is being represented.
Definitely. I think I'm starting to notice that with kids now. Like, say what you will about social media, it definitely has its drawbacks. But like the kids I see now, like a lot of them are like a lot more confident about like identifying as queer or like calling out racism. And I think that's really cool to see.
Look, I agree. And they've kind of grown up in a bit of a different space to the one that I grew up in. And there's a lot more confidence that I have found with the younger generation, and sort of more calling you on your bullshit, basically. Yeah, I'm not going to, and this whole boomer thing that's driving the older generation absolutely nuts.
Great.
Calling them boomers, they really hate it. And I find that highly, highly amusing. But anyway, I really do. So what would you like to have known when you were younger?
Oh God, I don't think I don't think it's a question of like what I would have known. It's just like, oh, maybe they're kind of intertwined for me. It's like, I think if there was someone that I could talk to about this stuff, like a
Right.
therapist or like a family friend, like it would have made so much difference. Like I would have not felt so alone in being the person I was. And so I think it would have been cool to know that there were such things like
Right.
psychologists or like people I could talk to at school potentially. I think mental health awareness has grown so much like
It
since I was
has.
in primary school. I don't even think like there was a school psych when I was in primary school, but I don't know, like I think it'd be, yeah, I wish I knew of services or like other people could talk to about these feelings.
So my last question kind of piggybacks onto that in some respects. Has this whole experience made you stronger, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if like strong's the right word. Yeah, I guess like in a sense, but in another sense, like I think like those experiences, like I don't know, I've kind of been to Mordor and back. Like I can sit and empathize with so many people who feel marginalized, who feel like they don't have like a group of people that they can turn to, who feel like left out. And like that's something when I really think about it, like makes me really happy and
Mm.
yeah, feel really good.
So you think it makes you a better clinician, and that maybe you're able to identify things potentially in a session or with somebody that somebody who hadn't necessarily experienced that wouldn't be able to pick up so quickly. I mean, clinicians have training to pick up certain things, but a lived experience always offers far more clarity, I feel.
Yeah, I feel that. And I think like clinician as well as person, like I think people like my clients know that like I'm not bullshitting them when I say like
Mm.
I really feel for you right now. I can imagine that you feel sad or angry or whatever. So like it's given me like a place of like genuine connection that I can draw on with a lot of people, like be they my clients or be they someone on the street.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that. And it's a perfect place to end on. So I just want to say thank you so, so, so much for agreeing to do this. And I know that you're hectic at the moment, and I know I had to interrupt a very busy schedule, and I know you're tired to schedule this in, but just thank you so much for making the time to do
My
this.
pleasure.
And thank you all for listening. If you want to see the video version of this podcast and you're listening to the audio, please go to my YouTube channel, International Immigrant, and subscribe so that you get updates whenever I add a new video. Please also head over and follow me on Instagram, international__immigrant. And for those of you that are listening, please subscribe to be notified when I release a new episode. If you have any questions that you would like me to answer in future episodes, please feel free to ask in the comments section on any of my platforms. And from my international immigrant journey to yours, see you next time.